Thank you for being with us once again today. Delighted to still be with Lauren Pearson this week for another episode of her journey. You know, we left you in the last two episodes with Lauren's journey through childhood, adolescence, early marriage, moving to Birmingham, and Andrew, her husband, becoming a rock star in the church and the Episcopal Church, and Lauren starting her business. And it was like they were on top of the world. And then what you're about to hear is when they just got the rug pulled out from underneath them. Lauren,
Hi.
we know end game is that you're just, success is just imprinted all around you these days. You have 3 offices, one in Charlottesville, Virginia, one in Birmingham, one in Beaufort, South Carolina. But would you take me forward and lay the landscape for what happened to you and Andrew and your 3 girls in 2021?
So to back up, Andrew was always Episcopalian and always in the Episcopal Church. And kind of like his first job out of college, there had always been some sort of like indigestion and where churches fell on lots of issues. But there was a pretty strong breakaway to the Anglican communion, which followed a different prayer book. And that would be almost like a whole podcast in and of itself to dissect the Episcopal Church and where it's been. But Andrew, ultimately, he was the dean of the Advent, and the Advent kind of always operated as other from the Episcopal Church in Alabama. And every diocese.
And so what does that mean, Lauren? Because this is important. It always operated as other.
They would say, it's even when you talk to people in the congregation, they're like, we're Episcopalian, but like we're the Advent. It's like the Advent had its own culture, its own way of doing things. Like you read on their website, I'm sure still today, that it's like, heart for the gospel-centered preaching, all of these things. And so that was the identity of the Advent. And Andrew was a very strong attractor to that identity. Like he could fully fulfill that vision. But the Episcopal Church has, and some people, I mean, there were bloggers that wrote about this, the religion of being Episcopalian. In some areas of the Episcopal Church, they think of themselves as their own separate thing, almost like the Catholic Church. Like a single congregation is not the same as like this whole denomination. So you have a church, and it's a large church, and it's an influential church that is really set apart within a structure that's much bigger than them. So there was a diocesan election, and there was going to be a new bishop. And this is important if you've ever seen the movie Moneyball. The bishop of a diocese actually is ultimately responsible for the ministers that come in and out of the diocese. So that person has a lot of influence. When they were calling a new bishop of Alabama, one of the top 3 things in the job description was fixing the Advent. You can imagine that because we truly were not in line with the diocese. I mean, and a lot of it had to do with money and funding. I mean, if we're being really honest, I think that's what some of it was. I don't think anyone would argue with me on that one. That seems to be pretty standard. The Advent was not giving to things that the rest of the Episcopal Church had committed to, because they were one of the more influential churches in the diocese. That became a financial mismatch.
Well, in fact, if I understand it, when you had your tithe card, you could say, I want my funds going to the diocese, or I want my funds going, or what portion I want going just to the Advent.
Right. You could do an Advent only pledge. And
that the largest church in the diocese, all of Alabama, the wealthiest church in the Diocese of Alabama, did not give all of its funding to the diocese.
Correct. And that was not well received, and so whoever the new bishop was going to be, one of their calls was going to be to get the Advent back in line. It was it was in the job description. So it became, it was in that election, it was very well stated that the Advent getting in more alignment with the remainder of the Episcopal Church in Alabama was going to be important, right? And because they'd always set themselves out as other, that was something that was going to need to be, there's going to be more emphasis on reconciling those two ideas. And so Andrew actually voted in favor of the current diocese Bishop of Alabama. Like, he thought she was the best choice, still does, for the Diocese of Alabama and the Episcopal Church. And so he was actually very sympathetic for her position, right?
Which that's so curious given what came later, that he voted for her and he was supportive of her, and he still is.
Correct.
And yet
he's no longer serving because, really what needed to happen is that his point to, the powers that be inside were, we are in fact an Episcopal Church. So it's like what they're asking is not an unreasonable ask, right? But he was very firm that he was not going to be able to lead them more in line with the Episcopal Church for theological reasons, because he really is a gospel-centered minister that is first and foremost above being Episcopalian, being Anglican, being whatever it is, the names and the titles and the cultures that we put within Christianity, which honestly can certainly turn people off. I can see why there's not where, sometimes I read things or hear things that, like, Christians are the best at turning Christianity off for people that might be exploring. It's really hard. And so, he just said, I can't lead you in this direction. And so it was,
Lauren, can I stop you for just a second? He was saying that to his board.
Correct. Right? Yeah, essentially,
he was saying that to the bishop, but that huge and powerful congregation didn't know what was happening behind the scenes.
We were coming out of COVID. Like, still the way that we congregated together was different. Remember, out of COVID, it just was there was less connection. So in some ways, it was the perfect time, right, to make a big move, because everyone was pretty disconnected, I would say. I'm sure we all remember that. I remember it like it was yesterday. And so
me too.
It was a strange time, and he was asked by a few people to resign, and then I can't remember if they told the vestry or the church or both that Andrew had just wanted to resign, that it was almost like an insinuation of burnout or, that part's still a little bit hazy to me because it was so much happening all at once. But, he didn't want to resign. But what he did want is for the church to make a thoughtful decision about the direction of where this congregation was going. And
you tell this story, you tell the story in such a way that today is kind of flat and non-emotional, but I was with you in those days, not as a member of the church, but as a friend.
Yes.
And you were both swirling with hurt and disbelief at how it had come down. Your family was kind of just thrown out, if you will. And you had been like the darling couple of Birmingham. The two of you just couldn't do wrong, You were a member of one of the best country clubs. There was nothing that wasn't open to you.
Right.
And then all of a sudden you were, you You were not welcomed everywhere.
Yes. And that was very harsh and very sudden.
So I want to go back for just a minute, because for those in the room who are listening, and I know your story so intimately, and I start to get, my anxiety is rising just as we talk about the story, but that's not at all the way you're telling it. Can you go back and make it make sense for people who don't understand anything about an Episcopal diocese and the absolute disparateness that happened from the most beloved pastor of all time to very suddenly, without his really knowing that it was going to snowball this way, being asked to leave, kind of thrown out?
Yes, it was
just a real different kind of snapshot.
Yeah, and I think like at the time, I think an important thing is that I was very angry. Like I was just like, this is incredibly unjust. But the thing that we really don't like in the South is when women are angry. Like that's like not an okay emotion to have at all, actually. Like it's not going to land. And I remember people saying to me like, you can't be angry. And I'm like, well, I am. So I don't know what to say about that, and it was really hard even with, because I was watching my whole family's life kind of like unravel, and really no one but potentially me having the skill set to like navigate that, just because I'd always transition. So it like from one environment to the next. And also because of the way that things were built, I had this little like pile of sticks that I was always playing with over here with my, this business that was so important to me, but like not to anyone else really. Certainly in the shadows of what Andrew was creating and had created. And so, but in that, like, because I didn't naturally fit in this was actually like oddly solid. Like I had 5 really close friends. And that circle where Andrew lost all of his friends, like he lost everything all at once. I mean, there were these people that said, oh, I'm going to pray for you. I'm going to be with you. They were gone, and all of a sudden it was like my friends, their husbands were the ones that were all of a sudden at the center of this ecosystem that was now important. And it was just really hard. And it's hard because at the time I didn't ever know what to expect in a given day. I think that was what was so frustrating, right? Like I didn't know if someone was going to ignore me in the grocery store, or if someone was going to bring a casserole to our house and then like really run away. Like it was like a ring and run, because they didn't want to actually like talk to me, but they wanted, or my family, like it was just such a weird, sad time. I mean, it was just like and I was angry about it because I have a heart for justice, and it was the most unjust thing that had ever happened to my family.
I just recall things like you sitting in front of me going, I don't even know, it was just maybe the day after or before. It was the week before Andrew preached his last sermon, which was so loaded, and the newspapers are writing on about it. AL.com's writing about it. Everybody in that small Mountain Brook community was talking about this, and it was divided as though it was Auburn and Alabama playing. That's how heightened it was. And I remember you saying things to me like, I don't even know what we own anymore. I don't know how we can exist in what we've created with this home because Andrew's out of a job.
Right.
And you said, we don't even know if we have a country club membership. I'm terrified for how my children are going to be treated at school, that this is the most talked about thing.
Yeah.
It was just something that for that small Southern community, the wealthiest church that existed there, kind of splitting apart, and you and Andrew and the girls were at the center of it, and there was no truth around the story. Nobody could really figure out what happened.
Right. And that's where it was just so it was like our whole life had just been turned upside down. And I certainly didn't know how to behave in that environment. I mean, it's like if I'm just
Yeah, I do remember you being so angry, and there was a thin veil over it, but you just wanted to tell everybody. But you were being a protector of your
right.
husband, whom you dearly loved. You saw him just devastated and hurt. You were being a protector of your children in a really difficult situation. And then you have a business to protect.
Right.
That some of those clients are the church congregation.
Yes. And it was very delicate. I mean, it really, really was. And Andrew is like in a crisis situation. I tend to go like very realistic and very sort of worst case scenario. So like almost negative, like not the sky is falling, but this is what I'm seeing as the true state of the union right now. Where Andrew was more optimistic, and that was almost like death by 1,000 cuts, because I would say like this thing is unstable, whether that be the country club or I don't know. I mean, fill in the blanks. Like this relationship, I'm like, that doesn't sound stable. And he would put eggs in those baskets because he was very optimistic. And then all of those things would go away.
So, Lauren, let's go back just for a minute. You've given me so many great parts of the middle of the story, what was happening to you and your family, and how painful it was, how deeply painful it was. And I have to say, it's obvious, but Andrew had just always been a star. It's like he was one of those golden ones. Nothing had ever gone wrong.
Right.
And then your lives were just absolutely turned upside down in a day. But
Yes.
Can you go back to the beginning of this and just kind of tell me what happened, and don't sugarcoat it?
Yeah. So, I mean, he would be on these calls with like the senior and the junior warden, and they basically just like asked him to resign. And then they would go in the vestry meeting and say that he resigned, and then he would write a letter to the congregation. So the vestry is a larger group within the congregational leadership body. And then there's the congregation, right? But because of COVID, it's more disparate than it has been traditionally speaking, And so just all of a sudden the congregation heard Andrew's gone. And like, again, we're in the polite deep South. Like people didn't know what happened. And I honestly can say, because it's such a polite culture, I really didn't understand what people were saying either. Like they wouldn't even say it to me. So I don't know what ultimately the storyline landed on or with various people. And I bet if you polled 4,000 people in the congregation, you'd get 3,000 different stories as to what happened. I mean, truly, I think probably some of the resounding ones are he was burned out. He just wanted to start his own church. What am I missing, Teresa? There was
a lot of talk about Andrew did not sit in the same place as the diocese on gay marriage and gay priests in the Episcopal diocese.
That's a good one, because that one is like, that was so, I guess, like sensational, even though it's kind of weird in 2024 to say like a homosexual issue is sensational. It's like feels like the fabric of who we are as a culture now, that's part of it. But that was an odd one, because people really, what Andrew always wanted is just to preach the gospel and have the gospel be preached in its true form as he saw it, of course. And what some of the like bloggers and news outlets clung to is like, oh, Andrew must not be for gay marriage or whatever it is. And I mean, that was such a tertiary issue. I don't even know if it ever came up. I mean, the Advent is arguably, or was even when Andrew was the head of it, the most like homosexual church in like the most gay people I think did go to that church. It was just that was a weird thing for people to hold on to, but I think it was a tangible thing that people could hold on to as a storyline. Even though I would say that was the least true of any of the things that were actually up for discussion as to why he left. So
I hear, I definitely, when I've stepped back from it 3 years later and I go back and I read what was written, and I've certainly been on the other end of AL.com reporting on me and having absolutely all the wrong information and ruining my life for a while.
yeah,
So I understand what that feels like, what that looks like, because there is reporting that is not factual.
right.
I think for me, looking at it now, the long and the short of it, the biggest pieces of it were about money. It was about funding.
Yes.
It was that the diocese wasn't getting the majority of the funds.
That's how I look back on it too. Like I
It
think it's
became, Andrew became a pawn in it, and there was no truth around, was he asked to resign? Was he asked to step down, or did he have a choice in it? And how it was handled was just unconscionably inhumane for Andrew, for you, for the girls.
yeah, there was no it was not delicate. In fact, I remember a woman, they had this like party for us as we were leaving. I thought that was very odd. All of these things were very odd to me. Like I couldn't reconcile them. And so they had this party to like send us away, which I thought was so weird because they'd ask us to go. But no one I knew that they asked us to go. So it was just this odd thing. And this woman that was kind of at the center of it came up to me in the receiving line. There was a receiving line. And she's like, I know you think that this is my fault. And I just looked at her and I was like, there was a gentler path. I mean, I just remember like being able to say that thing in the moment because there was. And, it was never up for congregational vote, discussion. It was just like, he's gone, moving on, and it was just so harsh. And quite frankly, like, I think that my family will never understand. I mean, it's like, it just isn't, but I do think it was the right thing. I don't wish to go back to that if that was always underneath the surface, and I think that that's an important thing about our story now is that,
So Lauren,
yeah,
take me to, like, I just find myself thinking, okay, you have your business in Birmingham. The nexus of your business is in Birmingham, Alabama. You have just been shut out by the elite community of Birmingham. Andrew's career, his whole career, was just shattered, basically. What did it look like in your house with Andrew and your 3 girls the day after his last sermon?
the day after it felt like freedom. Like it really did. I mean, I can say that like after, just because it had been so weird. And so the weeks between when it was announced that he had resigned and that the last day were some of like the most odd times of my whole life. Just like, again, never knowing what to expect from people, different reactions coming in. It was just a lot of things happening all at once, emotionally. And I think we were both really, really glad that we weren't in an environment like that anymore. I think there were a lot of things we didn't see that all of a sudden we saw and we're like, actually, is this the best place for him to do the ministry that he wants to do and is called to do?
Where were you with God and your faith in that really awful, what was it, 6 weeks? And life turned, I mean, your whole life went from one thing to being another thing in such a tiny amount of time?
It didn't crash then. It was a little bit later, and there was like a really specific thing that happened. So, it's in that time I'd always de-emphasized the Episcopal Church. Like I'd identified as Anglican because the Falls Church, which was my first church, was Episcopalian, then went Anglican. And really when I think about Anglicanism, there was this great class that the Falls Church taught on the 39 Articles. And it was the first time that I'd ever really said or thought about, oh, wow, I believe all 39 of these things to be true. Like this must be the denomination for me because this sits right with what I believe, and we would go into each article. And so for the first time, I felt like I could like wear a jersey, it was great. But I'd always kind of like de-emphasized the Episcopal Church because the Anglican Church really highlighted the 39 Articles in a way the Episcopal Church was like, oh, this is part of all that we do, and it's not the thing. But like actually going back, Martin Luther attacking the 39 Articles was the moment that we all became Anglican or whoever, identifies in that way. So to me, that was the most important. That was the primary. That was going back to the core of that part of Christianity. And so when all of this happened, I was not surprised at all because the building was owned by the Episcopal Church. And so it's like, to me, it was a lot. I think clarity is kindness. And I'm like, there's a lot of clarity that's happened here. I mean, I hate it, but I felt like there were parts of the even relationships that Andrew would have that I'm like, I just don't know if this is real. I mean, for me, it was always, I've never had like a million acquaintances. I've had like 5 close friends. Like that's just the way that I live my life. And I need to be in those sort of truth-centered relationships. And Andrew was better at the surface stuff, and it was just a lot of surface stuff all at once, and I think that all crumbled. So to me, with my faith, I'm like, well, God wouldn't honor any of this stuff anyway, from what I know it to be of Christianity. Like, I'm like, that wasn't what did it for me. Where I got really rocked is actually that minister that was the head of the Falls Church. He and his wife actually stepped into the situation. They have ties to the Advent. And they really wanted us not to plant a church, not to continue on, not to say anything. And that really did it for me. Like, for whatever reason, this, like, one of the only people, besides like Tim Keller, that I'd ever like held in spiritual esteem on earth. It was like this man, Tim Keller, and Andrew Pearson were the ones that I'm like, these are men I hold in high esteem, that I feel like are really like, I can receive what they say as truth. That pillar just completely fell. And that was where I had to get really right with the Lord about what Christianity is and what it's not. Because I had a pretty low view of establishment and what God thought of establishment, and I still do. But I had a high view of a few people, and I had to reorient that, like, even this man was not Jesus. And it was very disappointing. It's a
profound thing to say,
yeah,
being the wife of the dean of the Advent, that you could say, I had a very low opinion of the establishment of church. Not
yes.
a low opinion of Christianity, but to have lived in that milieu for all those years, but it had never become the thing that you clung to. Where was Andrew faith wise? Was he rocked? Was he wrecked?
He definitely had more undoing to do. Like everything was, and I look back on it now, at the time it was so harsh. The stripping away of everything, it was a stripping of the whole identity, and so I think it was with precision. I know it was, and that's like part of our story now in Virginia. But at the time it felt like he was just kind of hollow, but I didn't think about it too much because I would be too, like if I had put all of these things, if my whole life had been stripped away and I'd put a lot of emphasis on those things, like I felt almost like that was an appropriate response to the circumstance, that was, and I never really understood, like we were not always in alignment on the emphasis of the church. One story I'm thinking about is we went on vacation with this couple, the only couple, I didn't want to say the only couple, but we were close with this couple in the church. And it was our first like couple friend that we'd really had like in the church that I would say we were very, very close with. And we go on vacation one time to the islands. This was probably like 2.5 years before all of the stuff shook out. And we go down to Nevis and we're talking about the Advent the whole time. And like by day 3, I'm like, hey, like we have to live this all the time. And I know this is so important to all of us, but I wonder if on vacation we could just not talk about it, And I remember them all being disappointed. And that was the only time it was articulated to me that like I wasn't in full. There were 2 incidents, but that time was it. Why can't you just be supportive? And I remember being so frustrated, like, wow, we can't even go on vacation. Like, this is weird, right? Like, you're on vacation. You're supposed to be, like, listening to Simply Red and putting on suntan lotion. I mean, it's like, that's it. Like, that was all. I needed that. I needed, like, a few minutes. And when I voiced that, it was definitely, like, fell on deaf ears. I think even to Andrew, and that was hard for me. Like, that was a hard moment.
I want to pivot again for a moment to that day, the day after he preached his last sermon. You close the door, you're in your home alone with just your family. Everything you knew to be your life is gone.
Yeah.
And the shift that happened because it had to was Andrew no longer had an income.
Right.
And he had been the primary wage earner, and you had always sat on the sidelines. And in just that short amount of time, it was like, I'm it. Right now, I'm it.
Well, and there's a funny story about that too, because the only other time someone articulated their dissatisfaction with me working was a person that I don't even believe was a member of I don't think that they ever were a member of the Advent. So like, this is not a reflection on the Advent at all, but just on kind of like what was expected. And it was 3 months before all of this stuff started happening with Andrew. And I got an email. It was like, I woke up to it and it was like, hey, I see that, because things were starting to advance in my career too, right? Like I was building this team. Somerset was becoming a brand, not only in Birmingham, which is important, but like we were getting calls from Charlotte, from, California. Like we all of a sudden were having these kind of small regional and national moments, and so it was becoming this whole thing. Remember, I was like dreaming about it. It was awesome. Like all this great stuff was happening over here. And it really was great. And I was so excited about it. And this woman emailed me and said, your husband's never going to realize his full potential until you stop working. And it was like a real cut, even though I didn't ever respond to this email, but like I had to really sit with that. Like, am I holding back my husband's career? And the timing of it upon reflection was so interesting. And I had this group of like 4 other working women who I was close with. And I was like, what do I do with this? Like, I am so disappointed that we're still talking about this in 2020, 2021. I'm upset because is it true? Like, do more people think this? Um, it was very stripping. Like almost that moment when I like came in and fully Pulitzer felt the same. Like I was like, oh, I don't feel good. Like, and I don't know why. And so the day after, one of those women called me and she's like, I guess you're glad you held on to that job. I mean, it was just this funny like thing that happened that went full circle that she was trying to make me laugh, and she had been through divorce, and so she said, she was such a good, like the Lord just put the most awesome people in my life at that moment. Like I think about my friend who also has this protector instinct, and she and her husband were like, okay, we're planting a church, and she like became a Christian during the process. She wasn't even a Christian when we talked about planting a church, and now she is. I mean, it was so sweet looking back.
And I want to dive in right now because I know we don't have a lot longer. I just want to set you up for a minute because a lot of people don't even know what the words planting a church mean.
Oh, yes.
So you're out of the Advent, and it's like, what's next for us? What's next for Andrew? What's next for life? And a long time before, you'd said, we want to raise our kids in Birmingham.
Right.
So you were still committed to trying to make Birmingham work for you, even though you felt shattered by what had happened. And so you worked with some friends and even a few former members of the Advent, and you started to plant a church.
Yes.
Talk to me just briefly about what that looked like, felt like.
It felt awesome. I mean, I loved every bit of it. I mean, truly, I was so optimistic. And actually, Andrew was too. So it was like, we thankfully, because we knew this was kind of moving in, especially after he had they'd asked him to resign. Then we had these months to kind of like plan and dream and hope, right? That's what people do. And so he was like, I've always wanted to. And he really had always wanted to plant a church. Like it was not something that was new. He wanted to do it even at the Advent. He felt like, oh, we could go to Crestwood and plant a church or wherever, Homewood, and really look there. And so the idea of church planting, which is it for those of you who aren't familiar, it's just like taking a smaller group and saying, we're now going to commit to creating a structure in a various area for and some people plant for a season, like they just come in to help plant and then they move back to the main church or whatever it is. So, or some people just decide to prayerfully consider and stir and say, like, I just want to, I feel devoted to doing ministry in this area. And so let's get a group of people who might feel the same way. And so that's what happened by force, really, with us is like, okay, well, this is how we thought it was going to look, but like, here it is, And we had a really strong, sweet support from this group that it was my favorite church that I've ever been a part of. Like that, those early days of Grace Church were my absolute favorite. And everyone was very hopeful. So like, even though there'd been a lot of hurt, there was so much still of the need of like really being a household of faith and like being in pretty intimate community with a smaller group of people, which that's always been, I mean, of course it was perfect for me, right? Like I love that stuff. Like that's what I've always wanted. And so, and for the first time I felt like I could be a part of what his ministry looked like, right? Because it was already pre-built in South Carolina and at the Advent. So I was excited to be part of that. And my kids were too. Like everybody was. It was great.
So, and that came out of the ground. And I remember there was a lot of energy around it. And it sort of took form pretty quickly. And you had enough support that you were building a church.
Yes.
Right? And you both loved it. And then a year into it, Andrew came to you.
Yeah.
Right. And said,
he, what I noticed about him during that year is he was excited and like he was preaching well and the church was growing. But he couldn't fully like wrap his mind around it, you know? So we actually met with Joel and Lauren Brooks from Redeemer, and they're friends of ours and became friends during this process, you know, because it's just it's a wonderful church in Birmingham. If you're church hunting in Birmingham, try Redeemer. It's the best. And besides Grace Church, those two are my favorite. And so try Grace Church because it's the best. You got all of this. But I would say, you know, they became friends, and they were really helping us discern, because Andrew's like, I don't understand why I'm not feeling the way I thought I would feel in planting a church, you know? And so we went to them, and I'll never forget Joel saying, you know, Andrew, like, you are such an exceptional preacher that this thing is only going to keep getting bigger. And like, what do you do when it does? And we sat with that. And then about a week after that, he's like, I just can't lead this church. Because what was weird, I think what we weren't expecting, even though maybe we should have, is that the Advent was still like in all of the sweetness of Grace Church and all of the language saying like, we're not trying to be the Advent. We aren't trying to pull from the Advent. And it was very expressed in all of the materials. Like, this is not an anti-Advent church. And really what the Lord was creating, it was not that. I mean, it was not a split from the Advent. I mean, there were equally as many people that came from IPC or some other churches that were just looking for. We could look at the DNA of our leadership team and see at Grace Church that it was not just a response to the Advent. I mean, it was the DNA makeup of the leadership team was so solid from lots of churches in the area that just were looking for something different. I think it was well timed too, because it was right after COVID where people were evaluating what it looks like to be in community. So he just said, like Andrew said, I just can't lead it. And what was happening is stuff would be happening at the Advent, and we'd still be getting these calls, you know, from the leadership team at the Advent or whatever it was, like, why didn't you tell us? What is this? You know, it was silly stuff that it felt like he was going to be a perpetual scapegoat for the Advent as long as he was in Birmingham. We didn't really know that was going to be the case until a while after. And that was
You hadn't
really
taken
scary.
any time to heal or to breathe.
Yeah.
You both just went headlong. And I'm sure you were really ramping it up in your business because, again, he's planting a brand new church. There's no money coming in.
No,
Are the breadwinner.
yeah. It was
And so he
different.
came to you or, you know, with your friends or with you. And in the dark of night, I remember you talking to him about it and him just saying, I'm out. I'm spent.
Yeah.
I don't have anything else to draw from.
Yeah.
And so you made a huge life decision, life move. And it wasn't just about Andrew, because I remember you saying the most poignant thing I've almost ever heard. You said, I was watching my girls start not to stand.
Right. I
Tell me
think
about
I think what the Advent experience taught my girls, honestly, is that if you stand, that there's risk in that, which of course there is, and I was so proud of Andrew for like standing, and we're just people who stand, right? And so it was teaching them that it wasn't worth it to stand because you lose so much of things that make you feel comfortable, which you do. So it's like they are right, but it was so literal. They were so little. And I didn't want that. Like, I didn't want them to feel like that was the right answer, not to stand, you know?
I'm
Like
sure they felt a lot of pressure at school.
Yes.
And
was
they
pressure.
heard a lot of things that probably they didn't even bring home to you, but they were curling in on themselves, right?
Yeah, it was just not, my family was not thriving. And so then we started thinking about it. So I went to my team actually and said, if we weren't in Birmingham, what would happen? You know, like, are we strong enough? Because now I've built this awesome team at Somerset. We always say Somerset's like a constellation. Like, it's filled with shiny stars. Like, everybody on the team is a shiny star for sure. Much shinier than me.
So you went to your team at Somerset and you said, okay, what would happen?
What would happen if I wasn't in Birmingham? You know, and thankfully I noticed, like, I had the Buford experience, right? I moved a business before and it was fine.
You kept an office in Buford when you opened the Birmingham office, right? So you have 2 offices already. And you're saying to your thriving Birmingham team, what would happen if I am not here every day?
Right. And we looked at the business, and 40% of the business was in Birmingham, but 60% wasn't. And so it was like, we really started looking at it, and they saw, I mean, they were there for everything that happened. And so they knew what it was like. And they were so supportive, even though I love working beside Emily Lassiter more than anything. Like, she is it is such a gift to get to work with someone so closely. And I had wanted a partner my whole business career, you know, and finally I had one that I got to like share all this fun stuff with all the time. And it was like, all of a sudden that was going to go away. But it was the right decision for my family.
Oh, Lauren, that's a lot. Let's take a pause right here. You know, you've heard in this episode how Andrew and Lauren kind of were at the top of the world, and then they absolutely were not. And their lives really got turned upside down, questioning their identity, who they were in the world, why were they here, and so much trauma and devastation to their family, to their children. And then Andrew saying, I just can't do this anymore. So stay tuned next week, and we'll see where they go from here. Thank you.